The chain snapped. 120 pounds of pure muscle and teeth lunged across the velvet ropes, tearing a mahogany table clean off its heavy iron base. Grown men scrambled. Guns cleared holsters in a heartbeat, but nobody dared shoot the boss's prized animal. It was a bloodbath waiting to happen. Then, a waitress with a tray of half-eaten oysters stepped between the snarling beast and its victim. She didn't scream. She didn't run. What she did next made the deadliest men in the city hold their breath. The clock behind the bar of the copper anchor, read 11:40. Maeve knew this without, because her lower back was humming with that familiar, dull ache that only set in after hour 9 on her feet. The restaurant was an institution, though not the kind that made it into travel guides. It sat on a corner where the gentrified part of the city bled into the industrial shipping yards. Inside, it smelled of dry-aged beef, expensive cigars, and the faint, coppery tang of old blood baked into the floorboards beneath the heavy Persian rugs. It was a place where politicians ate in the front, and the men who bought those politicians ate in the back. Maeve was a back-room girl. She didn't want to be. The front room got the tourists who tipped a flat, 20%, and left without making eye contact. The back room got the men who tipped in, folded $100 bills, and looked at you like they were deciding whether to eat you or wear you. But her manager, a sweating, nervous man named Arthur, knew Maeve was the only server who didn't flinch when the clientele slammed their fists on the tables or left handguns casually resting next to the bread baskets. She didn't flinch because she didn't care. Fear required an energy reserve she simply didn't possess. When you were 3 months behind on rent and your mother's medical bills looked like a phone number, the threat of violence just felt like another tax you couldn't afford to pay. The heavy oak doors to the private dining room swung open. The temperature in the main hall seemed to drop 5 degrees. Declan Gallagher had arrived. He didn't walk in like a mob boss from the movies. There was no slow motion, no arrogant smirk. He moved like a blue-collar worker clocking in for a miserable shift. He was tall, built like a bricklayer who had been forced into a bespoke charcoal suit. His nose had been broken more than once, healed with a slight crook that ruined any classical symmetry his face might have had. He looked tired. He looked lethal. Behind him trailed his usual detail. 3 men, broad, silent, their eyes scanning the room with the mechanical efficiency of security cameras. And then there was the dog. Maeve paused, balancing a tray of dirty highball glasses on her hip. Gallagher brought the dog everywhere. It was a sprawling, terrifying beast. A cane corso and Pitbull mixed the color of wet slate. Its head was the size of a cinder block, its chest impossibly broad, tethered to Gallagher's massive fist by a thick, braided leather leash. The animal didn't walk. It prowled. Its heavy paws thumped against the hardwood floor, the only sound cutting through the sudden, suffocating silence of the restaurant. The patrons in the main dining room pretended not to notice. They looked down at their steaks. They chewed quietly. They drank their wine. Nobody wanted to draw Gallagher's attention, and absolutely nobody wanted to lock eyes with the dog. Maeve sighed, adjusting her grip on her tray. She pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen. "Table 7 is ready for the check," she told the bartender, sliding her tray onto the dish pit counter. "Gallagher's here!" Arthur hissed, popping up from behind the espresso machine like a frightened groundhog. He was dabbing his forehead with a bar napkin. "He's in the alcove. Maeve, you're on him." "It's my rotation anyway, Arthur," she said, her voice flat. She grabbed a fresh cloth from her apron and wiped down a water pitcher. "Just no sudden movements. The dog is on edge tonight. I saw it pacing outside." "It's an animal, Arthur. It paces," Maeve muttered. "No, I mean it." Arthur grabbed her wrist, his grip damp and weak. Gallagher's men are wound tight. Word on the street is a deal went bad this afternoon. A bad deal means bad moods. Do not mess up his order. Medium rare on the ribeye, heavy on the char. I know the order. Maeve pulled her arm away gently. She wasn't afraid of Declan Gallagher, and she wasn't afraid of his dog. She was afraid of her electricity being shut off on a Tuesday. Perspective was a funny thing. She filled 4 glasses with ice water, set them on her tray, and pushed back out into the dining room. The alcove was a semi-private booth tucked into the darkest corner of the restaurant. Gallagher sat in the center, his back to the wall. His men took the perimeter. The dog, a hulking mass of muscle, was sitting beside Gallagher's chair, its yellow eyes tracking every waiter, every busboy, every flickering candle. Maeve approached. She didn't smile. A fake smile was an insult to men who spent their lives detecting lies. "Evening," she said, setting the water glasses down in a smooth, practiced motion. "The usual for the table?" Gallagher didn't look up at first. He was staring at a cell phone resting flat on the mahogany table. He had thick, calloused fingers. Slowly he raised his head. His eyes were a startling, pale grey. They looked like dirty ice. "Yeah," he grunted. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. It sounded like it hurt to use. The dog shifted. It leaned forward, pressing its wet, heavy snout against Maeve's thigh. One of Gallagher's men, a guy with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, tensed, his hand dropping beneath the table. Maeve didn't step back. She didn't freeze. She just stood there as the beast inhaled her scent. It smelled the bleach on her apron, the stale grease of the kitchen, the cheap vanilla lotion she bought at the pharmacy. "He smells the steaks on the grill," Maeve said, her voice steady. Gallagher's eyes flicked to her. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift in his expression. "Usually people step back when he does that. I step back, I trip on the rug, I drop the water pitcher. Then Arthur yells at me. I'd rather take my chances with the dog." Gallagher stared at her for a long second. Then he gave a short, single tug on the leather leash. "Down, Brutus." The dog let out a low huff and collapsed onto the floor, resting its massive head on its paws, though its yellow eyes never left Maeve. "Ribeyes in 20, Maeve said, turning on her heel. She walked away, feeling the heavy gaze of 4 dangerous men, and 1 dangerous animal, burning into her spine. She survived round 1. The tip would be good. The night was half over. She had no idea that all hell was about to break loose. Dinner service hummed along in a tense, fragile rhythm. The air in the back room felt heavy, like the atmospheric pressure right before a thunderstorm. Maeve moved through it with the mechanical grace of a ghost, dropping off plates, refilling glasses, clearing away the wreckage of expensive meals. Gallagher's table was quiet. Too quiet. The men weren't eating with their usual appetite. They were checking their phones, exchanging sharp, low whispers. Gallagher himself had barely touched his ribeye. He was drinking scotch, his pale eyes fixed on the entrance to the alcove. The dog, Brutus, mirrored his master's tension. The animal hadn't slept. It was rigidly alert, its muscles twitching beneath its dark coat, occasionally letting out a low, vibrating growl that vibrated in Maeve's chest when she walked past. It happened at 12:15 a.m. A new party entered the back room. Not regulars. 3 men, dressed a little too flashy, their suits too loud for, the copper anchor. They walked with a swagger that reeked of cheap confidence. Maeve was at the post station, punching in an order for black coffee, when she saw Gallagher's right-hand man, the one with the scar, stand up abruptly. The flashily dressed men stopped. The leader, a guy with a slicked-back ponytail, smiled. It was a nasty, serrated thing. He said something. Maeve couldn't hear the words over the clatter of the kitchen, but she heard the tone. It was a challenge. Gallagher didn't stand. He just slowly wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and dropped it on his plate. Then a busboy, a kid named Toby, barely 19, who was covering his first Friday night shift, made a mistake. Toby was walking past Gallagher's table, carrying a large plastic bin filled with dirty silverware and heavy ceramic plates. He was staring at the standoff between the two groups of men, completely absorbed in the brewing violence. He didn't see the corner of the heavy Persian rug flipped up. Toby's foot caught. He stumbled hard. The bin slipped from his grip. 50 pounds of ceramic, metal, and leftover food crashed to the floor, less than 2 feet from Brutus's head. The noise was deafening, a catastrophic explosion of shattering plates and ringing steel. The reaction was instantaneous. The dog snapped. It wasn't a growl. It was a roar. The sound of a predator entirely consumed by blind, deafening instinct. The sudden crash, combined with the agonizing tension in the room, flipped a switch in the animal's brain. It went straight into the red zone. Brutus lunged forward with explosive force. The leather leash, wrapped around the leg of the heavy mahogany table, snapped taut. The table groaned, tilted, and then flipped, spilling scotch, water, and steaks across the floor. The men in loud suits shouted, reaching into their jackets. Gallagher's men drew their weapons in a blur of motion, but Brutus wasn't going for the rival crew. The dog, confused and overstimulated by the crash, lunged at the source of the noise. Toby was on his hands and knees, staring in absolute horror as the massive Pitbull closed the distance. The dog's jaws clamped down on the thick fabric of Toby's uniform jacket, right at the shoulder. Toby screamed, a high, reedy sound of pure terror. "Brutus, no!" Gallagher roared, his voice shaking the glassware. He lunged over the overturned table, grabbing the dog's thick collar. He hauled back with all his tremendous strength, the veins in his neck bulging. The dog didn't even register it. 120 pounds of muscle, completely blind with panic and adrenaline. It thrashed, its jaws locked, dragging the screaming busboy across the floorboards. Chaos erupted. Patrons were shouting, diving beneath tables. The rival men backed away, guns drawn, unsure of what to shoot. Gallagher's men were frozen. They had their guns out, but they were pointing them at the floor. You don't shoot the boss's dog. You just don't, even if it's mauling a kid. "Get him off!" Arthur shrieked from the safety of the bar, hiding behind the taps. "Somebody shoot it!" Gallagher punched the dog in the ribs, a heavy, sickening thud. "Drop it! Brutus! Drop!" Nothing. The dog was completely unreachable. Its eyes were rolled back, nothing but white and manic yellow. It was going to tear the kid's arm off, and once it tasted blood, it would go for the throat. Maeve stood at the POS station. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cynical voice in her head screamed at her to run out the back door, to go home, to let these violent men deal with their violent problems. But she looked at Toby. He was 19. He showed her pictures of his little sister on his phone. He was crying, his face stark white, completely paralyzed. She looked at Gallagher's men. Killers, enforcers, all standing there, absolutely useless in the face of raw, uncalculated nature. Maeve didn't think. If she thought, she would have run. She unclipped the heavy black tray from her belt. She grabbed a thick, wet linen towel from the counter, and she walked directly into the center of the madness. "Hey!" Maeve's voice cracked like a whip. It wasn't a scream. It was a deep, chest-driven bark that cut straight through the panicked shouting of the men. Gallagher looked up, his face flushed with exertion as he struggled against the dog's collar. "Get back!" he bellowed. "He'll tear you apart!" Maeve ignored him. She stepped over the shattered plates, her non-slip shoes crunching on the ceramic. When she was 10, her father had run a scrap yard on the edge of the city. He kept guard dogs, vicious, half-starved mutts that he trained to hate everyone but him. One day, a stray had gotten into the yard. The pack had cornered it. Maeve had watched her father wade into a violently thrashing pile of teeth and fur, armed with nothing but a metal pipe and a deep understanding of animal psychology. They go deaf when they're like this, May, he had told her later, wrapping his bleeding arm in gauze. You gotta break the circuit. You don't match their energy. You eclipse it. She was 2 feet away from the thrashing Pitbull. She didn't use the towel to hit the dog. She whipped it directly across the dog's line of sight, a sharp, snapping motion that created a sudden rush of air right over its nose. The dog blinked, a microsecond of hesitation. Maeve dropped to her knees, right in the splash zone, right next to its jaws. "Maeve, are you crazy?" one of the enforcers yelled. She ignored him. She didn't look at the dog's eyes. Never make eye contact with an aggressive animal. She looked at its chest. She took a sharp, deep breath in, filling her lungs to capacity, and let it out in a loud, forceful hiss through her teeth. Tst. It was a sharp, unfamiliar sound. Not a human word. Not a scream. The dog's jaws loosened just a fraction on Toby's jacket. "Let go, Toby," Maeve said, her voice unnervingly calm, low and smooth. "Slip your arm out of the sleeve. Now." I can't," the kid sobbed. "Do it, Toby, or you'll lose the arm. Go." Toby wrenched his body backward, sliding his skinny arm out of the oversized uniform jacket. Brutus stumbled back, suddenly holding nothing but a mouthful of empty black polyester. The dog shook the jacket violently, tearing it to shreds, and then dropped it. It whipped its massive head toward Maeve. The room went entirely silent. Even the breathing seemed to stop. 8 men with guns, a multi-million-dollar mob boss, and a waitress kneeling on the floor in front of a killer dog. Brutus bared his teeth. A low, rumbling growl started in his chest, vibrating through the floorboards. His ears were pinned flat. He was deciding whether to lunge. Gallagher tightened his grip on the collar, his knuckles white, but he didn't pull. Pulling would trigger the dog's opposition reflex. He just held his breath, watching the waitress. Maeve didn't move a muscle. She stayed on her knees, making herself small, but not cowering. She kept her head turned slightly to the side, exposing her neck, a universal canine sign of submission and non-threat. She didn't speak. She just breathed, slow, exaggerated breaths. In through the nose, out through the mouth. She let the tension bleed out of her shoulders. She relaxed her hands, letting them rest open on her thighs. She was projecting calm into a room drenched in adrenaline. 10 seconds passed. It felt like an hour. The heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like hammer strikes. Brutus took a step forward. His wet nose brushed Maeve's cheek. He was huffing, smelling the fear on her, but also smelling the absolute stillness. Maeve slowly, agonizingly slowly, raised one hand. She didn't reach for the top of his head. That was a dominant move. She offered the back of her hand, keeping it low, below the dog's chin. The pitbull sniffed her knuckles. The growl slowly hitched, then died in his throat. The red zone was fading. The animal's brain was rebooting. The ears slowly ticked forward. Maeve gently turned her hand over and scratched the soft spot right under the heavy leather collar. Brutus let out a massive, shuddering sigh. His back legs gave out, and he sat down hard on the floor, leaning his heavy weight against Maeve's shoulder. He was exhausted. The adrenaline crash was instantaneous. Maeve closed her eyes for a second, letting out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She opened her eyes and looked up. Declan Gallagher was staring at her. He wasn't looking at his dog. He wasn't looking at the rival gang still standing awkwardly near the entrance. He was looking at Maeve. His pale grey eyes were unreadable. The dangerous, tired mechanic was gone. He looked completely, utterly captivated. "Get him up, Mr. Gallagher," Maeve said softly, breaking the spell. Her voice was shaking now. The adrenaline was hitting her. "Before he gets wound up again." Gallagher moved slowly. He knelt beside her, his massive frame dwarfing hers. Up close, he smelled of expensive scotch, gunpowder, and clean sweat. He clipped a heavy metal carabiner to the dog's collar. "You didn't run," Gallagher said. His voice was barely a whisper, meant only for her. "I couldn't afford to lose my shift," Maeve replied, grabbing the edge of a table to pull herself up. Her legs felt like water. She turned to Toby, who was curled into a ball against the wall, weeping silently. "Go to the back, Tobes. Have Arthur pour you a ginger ale." "You're fine." The men in the loud suits at the front of the room quietly holstered their weapons. The leader with the ponytail cleared his throat, suddenly realizing that the atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. Gallagher wasn't distracted anymore. Gallagher stood up. He smoothed his tie. He didn't look at the rival men. He kept his eyes on Maeve as she began mechanically picking up unbroken glasses from the wreckage. "Colin," Gallagher said, his voice returning to its normal, gravelly rasp. The man with the scar stood at attention. "Yeah, boss. Clear the room," Gallagher said softly. "The gentlemen by the door have overstayed their welcome." Maeve kept her head down, picking up ceramic shards. She didn't look up as the sound of scuffling boots, muffled curses, and bodies being shoved out the back door echoed through the restaurant. She had just done something impossibly stupid. She had survived. But as she felt Declan Gallagher's eyes burning a hole in her back, she realized something much worse. She had made herself visible. In a world where being invisible was the only way to stay alive, she had just stepped straight under a spotlight. The mess took an hour to clean. Maeve swept the shattered plates into a heavy plastic bin, her hands moving with mechanical precision. She avoided looking at the blood on the floorboards. It wasn't Toby's. One of the rival men had caught a stray elbow from Colin during the violent eviction, leaving a few dark droplets near the entrance. Arthur was having a quiet meltdown behind the bar. He was counting inventory, losing his place, and starting over. Toby was gone. He had walked out the back door, clutching his torn shoulder, shivering violently, refusing to wait for a cab. Maeve dumped the bin in the dish pit and ran her hands under scalding water in the sink. She watched the water turn slightly grey from the grit of the floor. "Maeve," she didn't jump. She just turned off the tap and dried her hands on a clean towel. Declan Gallagher was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. It was a blatant violation of restaurant rules, but Arthur wasn't about to tell a man who practically owned the city's docks that he couldn't stand past the swinging doors. Gallagher had left the dog outside with his men. He looked too large for the cramped, stainless steel kitchen. The harsh fluorescent lights exposed the grey in his temples and the deep, exhausted lines bracketing his mouth. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a thick, manila envelope. "You shouldn't be back here, Mr. Gallagher," Maeve said, turning around to face him. "Arthur will have a stroke." "Arthur is currently drinking cooking sherry out of a coffee mug," Gallagher replied flatly. "He'll live." He stepped fully into the kitchen. He moved silently for a man of his size. No heavy boot steps, no jingling keys. "I came to settle the bill," he said, tossing the envelope onto the stainless steel prep counter. It landed with a heavy, muted thud. It was too thick to just be the cost of 4 uneaten steaks and a broken table. "Give it to Arthur," Maeve said, not stepping toward the counter. "I don't handle the register." "Arthur gets the price of the meal and the furniture," Gallagher said, his voice a low gravel. "The rest is for the kid, and for you." Maeve looked at the envelope. She knew what was inside. It was hush money. It was danger pay. It was the kind of cash that could wipe out her mother's dialysis bills for the next 6 months. The cynical, exhausted part of her brain screamed at her to take it, stuff it in her apron, and never mention it again. But she also knew how men like Declan Gallagher operated. They didn't give gifts. They created ledgers. If you took their money, you became a line item in their accounting book. "Toby will appreciate it," Maeve said carefully. "I'll make sure he gets it. But I don't need a tip for stopping your dog from catching an assault charge." Gallagher's jaw flexed. It was a tiny motion, but it betrayed a spike of irritation. Men like him were not used to being turned down. "It's not a tip. It's compensation for a workplace hazard," he said, stepping a fraction closer. "Take the money, Maeve." He knew her name. Of course he did. She wore a name tag, but hearing it in his raspy, quiet voice made the hair on her arms stand up. "I did what I did because I didn't want to watch a teenager get mauled on my shift," Maeve said, holding his icy gaze. "I didn't do it for a payout. Keep the envelope. Pay Toby. We're square." Gallagher stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He looked at the harsh lighting bouncing off her pale, tired face, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the frayed edges of her uniform collar. He saw everything. That was what made him dangerous. He didn't just look at people. He diagnosed them. "Nobody is ever square with me, Maeve," he said quietly. He didn't take the envelope back. He simply turned and walked out of the kitchen. Maeve stood alone in the hum of the refrigerators. She stared at the manila envelope sitting on the metal counter. It felt like a ticking bomb. She picked it up. It was heavy. She opened the flap. Inside were crisp, banded stacks of $100 bills. $10,000 at least. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. She had wanted to be invisible. Instead, Declan Gallagher had just put her on his payroll. The following Tuesday, the rain started. It was that relentless grey city rain that washed the garbage into the gutters and made the concrete smell like wet iron. Maeve lived in a fourth-floor walk-up in a neighborhood that hadn't seen a street sweeper in a decade. The radiator clanked all night, and the lock on the front door of the building was a joke. It was a miserable place, but it was cheap, and cheap was the only currency she had. She spent her morning off organizing her mother's medical bills into 3 piles on the rickety kitchen table. Final notice, past due, and negotiable. The 3rd pile was dangerously small. The envelope of Gallagher's cash sat in her top dresser drawer, buried under a pile of cheap winter sweaters. She had given Toby his half, slipping it into his mailbox in the dead of night, so he couldn't hand it back. But her half remained untouched. Spending it felt like stepping onto a landmine. At noon, Maeve put on her waterproof jacket and walked 4 blocks to the discount grocery store. She kept her head down, dodging puddles, calculating whether she could afford fresh vegetables, or if it was another week of canned soup. She felt it before she saw it. It was a heavy, prickling sensation at the base of her neck. The instinct of prey. Maeve stopped at the corner, pretending to tie her shoe. She glanced at the reflection in a dark puddle near the curb. A black Lincoln Town car was idling half a block back. It was completely out of place on this street of rusted sedans and delivery trucks. The windows were heavily tinted, but she didn't need to see inside. She stood up, her jaw tight. She walked into the grocery store, took a basket, and began moving down the aisles. 10 minutes later, she walked out with a plastic bag of groceries. The town car was still there. Maeve didn't run. She didn't speed up her pace. She walked directly toward the vehicle, feeling the rain hit her face. As she approached, the driver's side window hummed down 2 inches. She saw the scarred eyebrow and the dead, flat eyes of Colin. "You're blocking a fire hydrant," Maeve said, stopping a foot from the door. Colin didn't flinch. He just looked at her, chewing slowly on a toothpick. "Boss wants to make sure you get home safe in the rain. It's water, Colin. Not acid," Maeve said, gripping her grocery bag tighter. "I've been walking this street since I was 12. Tell your boss I don't need a chaperone." "I don't tell Mr. Gallagher what to do," Colin said, his voice devoid of emotion. I just do what he tells me. Keep walking, Maeve. I'm just part of the scenery. The window hummed back up, cutting her off. Maeve stood in the rain for a moment, her knuckles white around the plastic bag handles. The feeling of suffocation was intense. Declan Gallagher wasn't just observing her anymore, he was mapping her life. He was setting up a perimeter. 2 days later, she worked the Thursday day shift at the Copper Anchor. Day shifts were usually quiet. Business lunches, solitary drinkers, old men reading the newspaper. The bell above the door chimed at 2 p.m. Maeve was wiping down the bar when she looked up. Gallagher walked in. He wasn't wearing a suit this time. He wore a dark canvas jacket, a plain black t-shirt, and heavy boots. Without the bespoke tailoring, he looked rougher, more violent. Brutus trotted at his side on a shorter, heavy-duty leash. The few patrons in the restaurant subtly shifted in their seats, eyes darting to the exits. Gallagher ignored them. He walked straight to a booth near the windows and sat down. Maeve grabbed a menu and walked over. Before she could speak, Brutus let out a sharp whine. The massive dog stood up, his tail wagging in a stiff, heavy rhythm, and bumped his large head roughly against Maeve's leg. "Sit," Gallagher commanded quietly. The dog immediately dropped its rear to the floor, but its yellow eyes stayed fixed on Maeve, panting happily. "He remembers you," Gallagher said, leaning back in the booth. He looked at her with those pale, analyzing eyes. "I smell like raw beef and old bread. Every dog in the city loves me," Maeve replied, placing the menu on the table. "What can I get you? The kitchen is transitioning, so it's only sandwiches and salads. Black coffee. No food," Gallagher said. Maeve nodded and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "You haven't spent the money." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Maeve stopped, turning back to face him. Her heart gave a slow, heavy thump. "How do you know that?" she asked, her voice tight. "Because you're still walking in the rain to buy dented cans of soup, and your mother's clinic hasn't received a payment this month," Gallagher said smoothly. Anger, hot and fast, flared in Maeve's chest. The cynical armor cracked. "You ran a background check on me. You looked into my mother's medical records." "I look into everyone who steps into my orbit," Gallagher said, completely unapologetic. "Especially people who don't flinch when a 120-pound killer goes off the rails. I needed to know what you are." "I'm a waitress," Maeve snapped, leaning over the table, dropping her voice so the room wouldn't hear. "I'm a waitress who works double shifts to keep the lights on. That's it. There's no mystery. There's no hidden agenda. You gave me money I didn't ask for, and now you have your guys stalking me in the street." "It's not stalking, it's security." "I don't need your security." Gallagher's eyes darkened. The air around the table seemed to compress. "Everyone in this city needs security, Maeve. The ones who don't realize it are the ones who end up in the morgue. You live in a neighborhood run by bottom feeders. You owe money to a clinic that uses local leg breakers to collect debt. You are vulnerable. I handle my own problems. By getting crushed under them?" Gallagher tilted his head. "Use the money. Pay the clinic. Buy an umbrella. If I use the money, I owe you." "You don't owe me anything. You saved my dog." "Bullshit," Maeve hissed. "Men like you don't believe in clean slates. You believe in leverage. You want me to take the money so you can put me in a box with the rest of your assets. Well, I'm not an asset." She didn't wait for his response. She turned and walked directly to the coffee station, her hands shaking slightly as she grabbed a mug. She poured the black coffee. When she brought it back to the table, Gallagher was looking out the window, watching the street. He didn't look angry. He looked calculating. "Enjoy your coffee," she said coldly. "You're a stubborn woman, Maeve," he said, finally looking at her. "But stubborn doesn't stop a bullet, and it doesn't pay a debt." She walked away, feeling the heavy weight of his stare following her all the way back to the kitchen. He was a man used to breaking horses, and he had just realized she wasn't a horse. She was a mule, and mules didn't break, they just planted their feet. The problem with living on the ragged edge of poverty wasn't just the lack of money, it was the lack of a safety net. If one thing snapped, the whole structure collapsed. For Maeve, that snap happened on a Thursday night, 3 days after her argument with Gallagher. She was walking home from her shift. It was past 1 a.m. The streetlights on her block had been shot out by local kids months ago, leaving the pavement cloaked in heavy, oppressive shadows. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of overflowing dumpsters. She turned the corner onto her street and stopped. Sitting on the crumbling concrete steps of her apartment building were 2 men. Maeve recognized the one on the left immediately. Kieran. He wasn't Mafia. He wasn't organized crime. He was a local thug, a bottom feeder who ran collections for the predatory loan companies and shady medical clinics in the district. He wore a cheap leather jacket and had a face that looked like it had been molded out of dough and left in the sun. Maeve gripped the strap of her canvas bag. She was 2 blocks from a main road. If she ran, they would catch her before she hit the avenue. "Evening, Maeve," Kieran called out. He stood up, flicking a cigarette butt onto the sidewalk. His partner, a heavy-set man with a shaved head, flanked him. Maeve kept walking, closing the distance but staying on the far edge of the sidewalk. "Kieran, it's late. What do you want?" "Just doing a little customer service check-in," Kieran said, stepping directly into her path. He smiled, showing stained teeth. "The clinic down on 4th says you missed your mother's payment again." 3 months in a row, Maeve. "They're getting nervous. They sold the paper to my boss. That means you owe me now." "I get paid on Friday," Maeve said, keeping her voice level. "I'll drop off the installment then." "Yeah, see, the installment plan is cancelled," Kieran said, stepping closer. He smelled like stale beer and cheap cologne. "Boss wants it all. 4 grand. Tonight." "I don't have 4 grand on me, Kieran. Nobody carries that kind of cash. Then we're going to have to take collateral," the heavy-set man grunted, reaching out and grabbing the strap of Maeve's bag. Maeve yanked back hard, adrenaline flooding her system. "Get off me!" Kieran lunged, grabbing her wrist with a bruising grip. "Don't be stupid, bitch. We can go upstairs and start pulling appliances, or you can—" Kieran never finished his sentence. From the absolute darkness of the alleyway beside the apartment building, a massive, terrifying shape moved. There was no growl, no warning bark, just the sudden, sickening sound of 80 pounds of muscle slamming into a human body. Brutus hit the heavy-set man square in the chest. The man let out a wet, breathless shriek as he was launched off his feet, crashing backward into a row of metal trash cans. The dog didn't bite. It just pinned him, planting 2 massive paws on his chest, snapping its jaws inches from the man's face. A low, demonic rumble vibrating in the narrow space. Kieran froze, his grip loosening on Maeve's wrist in sheer shock. A heavy footstep echoed on the pavement. Declan Gallagher stepped out of the shadows. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a dark trench coat, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked entirely calm, entirely lethal, and completely at home in the dark. Behind him, Colin stepped into the dim light, holding a heavy steel tire iron casually in his right hand. "Let go of her arm," Gallagher said. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried perfectly in the quiet street. Kieran dropped Maeve's wrist as if it had suddenly caught fire. He took 2 stumbling steps backward, his eyes darting from the snarling Pitbull to the mob boss. Kieran was a bottom feeder, but he knew exactly who the apex predator of the city was. "Mr. Gallagher," Kieran stammered, his tough guy facade completely shattering. We were just collecting a debt. Legal paper, I swear." "You bought debt on a woman who is under my protection," Gallagher said slowly, walking forward. "That's a mistake, Kieran." "I didn't know. Nobody said nothing about her being with you." Gallagher stopped a foot away from the terrified thug. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pull a weapon. He just looked down at him. The debt is cancelled. The paper is burned. If you or your boss or anyone from that clinic ever speaks to this woman again, I will have Colin put you in a shipping container and drop you into the harbour. Do you understand? Yes, absolutely. Debt's clear. Kieran was trembling visibly. Take your garbage and leave, Gallagher said, nodding toward the man trapped under Brutus. Gallagher gave a sharp whistle. Brutus immediately stepped off the heavy-set man, returning to Gallagher's side, though his yellow eyes never left the thugs. The two men scrambled to their feet and practically sprinted down the street, disappearing into the darkness without looking back. Silence fell over the pavement, broken only by the distant wail of a siren and Brutus's heavy panting. Maeve stood frozen. Her wrist throbbed where Kieran had grabbed her. She should have been relieved. She should have felt safe. Instead, she felt a tidal wave of pure, white-hot fury. She turned on Gallagher. "Who the hell do you think you are?" she shouted, her voice echoing off the brick walls. Colin tensed, gripping the tire iron tighter, but Gallagher held up a hand, stopping him. "I just saved you a hospital visit, Maeve," Gallagher said calmly. "I didn't ask for your help!" Maeve stepped into his space, completely ignoring the sheer size of him, ignoring the danger. She shoved a finger into his chest. It felt like poking a brick wall. "You don't own me. You don't get to step into my life, cancel my debts, and declare me your property. I am not under your protection." Gallagher looked down at her. His eyes were unreadable, but his jaw was locked tight. "Those men were going to hurt you. They were going to take my television and my microwave," she fired back. "I've dealt with Kieran before. I know how to survive in my own neighborhood. But now he thinks I'm your property. Now everyone in this district is going to think I belong to a cartel boss. You just painted a massive target on my back. Nobody will touch you." "Because they're afraid of you!" Maeve yelled, her voice cracking with exhaustion and rage. "That's not safety, Declan. That's captivity." She used his first name. It slipped out in the heat of the moment, and it hung in the humid air between them. Gallagher stared at her, the silence stretching out. The anger in his eyes slowly shifted, replaced by something much darker, much more intense. He took a step forward, completely closing the distance between them. He towered over her, his broad shoulders blocking out the meager light from the street. "You think you're surviving, Maeve," he said, his voice dropping into that dangerous, raspy register. "You're drowning. You're working yourself into an early grave to pay off vultures who will pick your bones clean. You're so damn proud of your independence that you'd rather be beaten in an alley than accept a hand up." "Your hand doesn't pull people up," Maeve whispered, refusing to back down, looking him dead in the eyes. "Your hand drags people down into the mud with you." Gallagher didn't blink. He reached out slowly, his large, calloused hand moving toward her face. Maeve flinched, but she didn't step back. He didn't strike her. His thumb gently grazed the red, bruising skin on her wrist where Kieran had grabbed her. His touch was shockingly gentle for a man with so much blood on his hands. "Maybe," Gallagher murmured softly, his eyes dropping to her bruised wrist, then back up to her defiant face. "But right now, I'm the only thing standing between you and the wolves. And whether you like it or not, Maeve, you are mine to protect." He dropped his hand, stepped back, and whistled for the dog. "Sleep well," he said, turning away. Maeve stood on the sidewalk, her heart pounding, a frantic rhythm against her ribs, watching the Blacktown car pull out of the alley and disappear into the night. The debt to the clinic was gone. But a new, terrifying ledger had just been opened, and the currency was no longer cash. It was control. And she was determined to fight him for every inch of it. The immediate consequence of Declan Gallagher's protection was total isolation. By Monday morning, the atmosphere at the Copper Anchor had fundamentally shifted. Arthur didn't yell at Maeve for clocking in 3 minutes late. He didn't make eye contact at all. He scheduled her for the best sections, the prime shifts, and quietly transferred the most lucrative tables to her rotation. The other waitresses stopped complaining about sore feet in the break room when she walked in. They just fell silent, stirring their coffees with tense, mechanical motions. Word had spread. In a city governed by whispers, the news that Gallagher's men had nearly beaten a loan shark to death over a waitress was front-page news for the underworld. Maeve wasn't a co-worker anymore. She was a liability, a walking tripwire. It was suffocating. She preferred the abuse, the bad tips, and the exhaustion. That was a word she understood. The deference felt like a terminal diagnosis. People only treated you like glass when they knew you were surrounded by explosives. On Wednesday afternoon, Maeve returned to her apartment. The black Lincoln Town car was parked across the street. Colin was behind the wheel, reading a newspaper. He didn't look up as she walked past, but she felt the heavy weight of his surveillance like a physical pressure against her ribs. She walked up the 4 flights of stairs. The lock on her door had been fixed, replaced, actually, with a heavy-duty deadbolt that she hadn't requested and certainly couldn't afford. She stood in her narrow kitchen, staring at the brass fixture. The anger she felt wasn't a hot, flashing thing anymore. It was a cold, dense block of iron sitting in her stomach. Gallagher had reached into her life, rearranged the pieces to his liking, and locked the door behind him. Maeve walked into her bedroom. She opened the top drawer of her dresser, shoved aside the cheap wool sweaters, and pulled out the manila envelope. $10,000. She didn't want a guardian angel with a body count. She wanted her life back. She shoved the envelope into her canvas messenger bag. She didn't put on her uniform. She wore a faded denim jacket, black jeans, and boots that had been resoled twice. When she stepped out onto the street, Colin finally lowered his newspaper. Maeve didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the passenger side of the Lincoln and yanked the door open. Colin's hand vanished inside his jacket in a microsecond, his dead eyes locking onto her. "Put it away, Colin. It's just me," Maeve said, sliding into the leather seat and slamming the door shut. The interior smelled of peppermint gum and gun oil. Colin slowly withdrew his empty hand, resting it on the steering wheel. He didn't look surprised. He just looked tired. "You're not supposed to be in the car, Maeve. Take me to him. Mr. Gallagher is working. He doesn't take unannounced visitors." "I'm not a visitor. I'm a problem he needs to solve," Maeve said, her voice flat. "Take me to him, or I roll down this window. Start screaming and make a scene so loud the precinct down the block comes running. You want to explain to your boss why you got arrested for kidnapping?" Colin stared at her for a long, heavy moment. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He didn't smile, but a glint of begrudging respect flickered in his dark eyes. "Put your seatbelt on," he grunted. He shifted the car into drive. They drove toward the industrial district. The gentrified coffee shops faded into pawn shops, which faded into chain-link fences and towering stacks of rusted shipping containers. The sky overhead was a bruised, heavy grey. Colin pulled the Lincoln through a pair of heavy iron gates, manned by 2 guys who looked like linebackers. They arrived at a massive, corrugated steel warehouse right on the edge of the deep-water harbour. Maeve got out. The air here smelled heavily of diesel exhaust, salt, and decaying fish. Colin led her up a flight of rusted metal stairs bolted to the exterior of the warehouse. He opened a heavy steel door at the top. The office inside was a jarring contrast to the grim exterior. It was vast, climate-controlled, and immaculately clean. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the sprawling shipyard. There was no mahogany furniture here, just sleek, utilitarian steel and glass. Declan Gallagher sat behind a massive desk. He was in his shirt sleeves, The cuffs rolled up past his forearms, revealing faded, intricate ink that disappeared beneath the crisp cotton. He was looking at a ledger. Brutus was asleep on a thick orthopedic rug by the window. At the sound of the door, the dog's head snapped up. Recognizing Maeve, the heavy tail gave a slow, rhythmic thump, thump, thump against the floorboards. Gallagher looked up. He didn't look angry that she was there. He just looked at Colin. "She threatened to scream kidnapping," Colin said simply, shrugging his broad shoulders. "Didn't want to draw a crowd." Gallagher gave a short, rough exhale that might have been a laugh in another life. "Wait outside, Colin." The door clicked shut, leaving Maeve alone in the room with the boss and the dog. She walked forward. She didn't stop until her knees hit the edge of the glass desk. She unzipped her canvas bag, pulled out the manila envelope, and slammed it down onto the ledger. "Take it back," Maeve said. Her voice didn't shake. Gallagher leaned back in his chair. He looked at the envelope, then up at her. "I told you, the debt is cleared. The money is yours. I don't want it. I don't want the new deadbolt on my door. I don't want the guys at work treating me like I'm made of nitroglycerin. I don't want your driver parked outside my building." "You want to go back to being prey," Gallagher stated, his grey eyes locked onto hers. "I want to go back to being invisible." Gallagher stood up. He was so large, he seemed to eclipse the grey light pouring in from the windows. He rested his knuckles on the desk, leaning closer to her. "You lost the right to be invisible the second you stepped in front of a 120-pound animal to save a kid you barely know," Gallagher said quietly. "You showed everyone in that room what you were made of, including me. That doesn't make me yours to manage. It makes you a target, Maeve." His voice dropped, losing the smooth control. "The men I threw out of the restaurant that night. They don't let disrespect slide. They've been asking questions about the waitress who calmed my dog. They know I paid your debts. They know I have Colin watching you." "Then you used me as bait," she whispered, the realization hitting her like a punch to the stomach. "No." Gallagher's jaw tightened. "I put a wall around you so they couldn't use you as leverage against me. There's a difference. Not from where I'm standing." Maeve turned around. She was done. She had delivered the money. She was leaving. She made it exactly 3 steps toward the door. The heavy glass window overlooking the shipyard didn't just break, it detonated. The sound was catastrophic, a deafening, concussive boom that sucked the air out of the room. Shards of thick, tempered glass exploded inward, spraying the office like shrapnel. Maeve didn't have time to scream. The instinct to freeze was completely overridden by a massive, crushing weight slamming into her back. Gallagher tackled her to the hardwood floor. He didn't grab her gently. He hit her with the force of a freight train, driving the breath from her lungs in a sharp gasp. He covered her body entirely with his own, his heavy canvas jacket shielding her head as a second volley of automatic gunfire chewed through the drywall and shattered the computer monitors above them. The office filled instantly with the acrid, choking stench of pulverized drywall, shattered electronics, and cordite. "Stay down!" Gallagher roared over the deafening noise. His voice vibrated through her ribs. Brutus was barking, a terrifying, frenzied, echoing roar. The dog hadn't been hit. He was pacing wildly near the door, his instinct screaming for blood. The gunfire paused. The silence that followed was heavy, ringing in Maeve's ears. "Colin!" Gallagher barked, rolling slightly off Maeve, pulling a heavy, matte-black handgun from the holster at the small of his back. The steel door to the office kicked open. Colin crawled in low, blood dripping from a shallow cut on his cheek. He had a weapon drawn. 3 shooters, from the crane gantry across the yard. They used rifles, then moved to the stairs. "They're coming up," Gallagher said grimly. He looked down at Maeve. She was covered in white dust, coughing, her eyes wide with shock, but she wasn't crying. "Can you move?" he demanded. "Yes," she choked out. Gallagher grabbed her by the collar of her denim jacket and hauled her to her feet, shoving her brutally toward the far corner of the office, behind a massive steel filing cabinet. "Do not move from this spot. Do not stand up." Footsteps pounded on the metal stairs outside. Heavy, fast. Gallagher didn't take cover. He stood right in the center of the ruined office. He whistled, a sharp, piercing sound. Brutus locked onto him, muscles coiled tight. "Take them," Gallagher commanded. The first shooter breached the doorway. It was the guy with the ponytail from the restaurant. He had an automatic weapon raised, his eyes scanning through the smoke. He never even pulled the trigger. Brutus hit him, waist high. The sheer kinetic energy of the dog launched the shooter backward out the door and onto the metal landing. The man's scream was completely drowned out by the guttural, tearing snarls of the animal. The second shooter stepped into the doorway, panicking, trying to aim at the thrashing dog. Gallagher raised his handgun. He didn't blink. He fired twice. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The shooter dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Colin moved with terrifying efficiency, sliding out the door to clear the landing, firing a single, muffled shot. The silence rushed back in. It was absolute. Maeve huddled behind the filing cabinet. Her hands were clamped over her ears. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps. She had seen violence before, bar fights, street muggings, but this was an entirely different species of violence. This was mechanical, cold, and utterly permanent. "Clear!" Colin shouted from the landing. "Call the cleaners. Lock down the yard," Gallagher ordered. His voice was perfectly level. Maeve heard the heavy, rhythmic thumping of the dog's paws. Brutus trotted back into the office. His dark coat was slick with blood, but he wasn't limping. He walked straight over to Maeve's corner, sniffed her dusty boots, and sat down in front of her, forming a physical barrier between her and the carnage by the door. Gallagher walked over. He looked down at her. His face was covered in a fine layer of dust, his pale eyes burning. "Are you hit?" he asked. Maeve slowly lowered her hands. She looked at him. She looked at the blood dripping onto the floorboards from his left arm. The crisp white fabric of his sleeve was soaked crimson just below the shoulder. "You are," she said, her voice raspy from the smoke. Gallagher looked at his arm as if he were mildly annoyed by a stain. "It's a through and through. Grazed the muscle." "Sit down," Maeve ordered. She didn't know where the authority came from. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe it was the sheer absurdity of the situation. Gallagher raised an eyebrow, but he didn't argue. He walked to a leather armchair that had miraculously survived the crossfire and sat heavily. Maeve stood up. Her legs wobbled, but they held. She walked past the shattered glass, ignoring the bodies in the hallway. She went into the small adjoining bathroom, ripped the first aid kit off the wall, and walked back. The office was quiet save for the distant wail of harbour sirens and Colin barking orders into a burner phone down in the yard. Maeve stood in front of Declan Gallagher. She unbuttoned the cuff of his blood-soaked shirt and ripped the sleeve up past his bicep. The bullet had taken a clean gouge out of the outer muscle. It was bleeding sluggishly, dark and thick. "This is going to burn," she said, unscrewing a bottle of iodine. "I've had worse," Gallagher replied, his eyes fixed on her face. She poured the iodine directly over the wound. Gallagher's jaw clamped shut, the muscles in his neck cording like steel cables, but he didn't make a sound. Maeve's hands were remarkably steady. She had patched up cooks who sliced their hands open on meat slicers and bartenders who caught broken glass. Flesh was just flesh. She grabbed a thick pad of gauze and pressed it hard against the wound. "Hold this," she instructed. Gallagher placed his massive hand over hers, trapping her fingers against his skin. His hand was warm, heavy, and completely unshakable. "You didn't scream," he said quietly. "Screaming doesn't stop bullets," Maeve replied, keeping her eyes focused on the bandage. She grabbed a roll of medical tape and began wrapping it tightly around his bicep. "They came here because they thought they could hit me where I was weak," Gallagher said. His voice was low, intimate, in the ruined room. They thought because I was paying your debts, you were a soft spot. Leverage. I told you, Maeve whispered, tying off the tape and finally looking up at him. You painted a target on my back. I did, Gallagher admitted, no trace of apology in his tone, only cold fact. And I'll kill every single man in this city who looks at that target. But you need to understand something, Maeve. He shifted his grip, sliding his hand from her fingers to her wrist. He didn't squeeze, but the hold was absolute. You can walk out of here right now, he said. You can take your envelope. You can go back to your apartment. But they know who you are now. And the wolves in this city don't care if you want to be invisible. They only care about what they can take. Maeve stared into his pale, exhausted eyes. She felt the heavy thumping of Brutus's tail against her leg. The dog had curled up around her boots, again, resting his massive head on her shin. She looked at the blood on her hands. Gallagher's blood. She looked at the destroyed office, the shattered glass, the sheer, violent reality of his world. She had spent her entire life trying to stay out of the mud, trying to keep her head down, pay her bills, and survive another week. But survival was a solitary, grinding disease. She wasn't going back to the restaurant. She wasn't going back to the dark alleyways and the lone sharks. She had stepped over a line the night she faced down the dog, and there was no walking backward. If I stay, Maeve said, her voice steady, cutting through the smell of gunpowder. I don't belong to you. I am not an asset. I'm not leverage. I don't sit in a penthouse and pretend this blood isn't real. Gallagher's mouth curved into the faintest ghost of a smile. It was the first time she had seen him look anything close to satisfied. I wouldn't let you, he said. He let go of her wrist and reached up, his rough thumb gently wiping a streak of drywall dust from her cheek. You're not a pet, Maeve, he murmured. You're the only person in this God-forsaken city who looks at the monster and doesn't blink. Maeve didn't pull away from his touch. She stood in the center of a bullet-riddled room, a mob boss bleeding in her hands, a killer dog sleeping at her feet, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel afraid of the dark. She felt like she owned it. And that's how Maeve went from an invisible waitress to the untouchable iron core of Declan Gallagher's empire. She didn't need saving. She needed a partner who matched her grit, and she found it in the most dangerous man in the city. What did you think of Maeve standing her ground during the shootout? Let me know in the comments if this gritty, high-stakes romance kept you on the edge of your seat. Smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and hit subscribe so you never miss another deep dive story. Stay safe out there.